Iran's had a long relationship with Hamas. Hamas wouldn't be Hamas without the support over many, many years
It's
from
been
Iran.
a week since the deadly attack on US soldiers at the Tower 22 base in the northeast of Jordan. The drone strike immediately blamed on an Iran-backed militia.
3 caskets holding Staff Sergeant William Rivers, who today received a posthumous promotion.
The first phase was largely conducted by long-range B-1 bombers flown all the way from Texas, refueling mid-air en route to the Middle East.
This airstrike has led to the explosion of equipment and rockets stored in these buildings. The shrapnel from the rockets flew inside the residential compound. It caused damage to the buildings, equipment, and the people's properties, and 1 citizen was martyred.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. If you thought Iraq was a calamity, a moral, military and geopolitical disaster, wait until the West goes to war with Iran, because, listener, you ain't seen nothing yet. Recorded amid a US bombing campaign against Iranian proxies in Syria and Iraq, as well as Houthi positions in Yemen. In this special episode, Multipolarity examines the increasing likelihood of direct war between the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran. We look at US warfighting doctrine, how it would try and whether it could invade Iran to effect regime change, the effects, aims and probable outcomes of a concerted bombing campaign, and the likely disastrous blowback from any such campaign, including military losses, cyber attacks, sleeper cells, terror attacks within Western Europe and the continental United States. We also look at how the Western world has got itself boxed in to such a terrible strategic position in the Middle East, and how it might seek to escape, why it probably can't, and the dismal consequences of that ineptitude. To discuss this matter tonight, we have Malcom Kyeyune, friend of the podcast, who is back with us for, I believe, the 4th time. Malcom is an essayist with Compact magazine and other outlets, including The New Statesman. He also has an alter ego, Tinkzorg, which is now found at the handle Sword Mercury on X Twitter, which combines quite erudite comments about military matters and geostrategy with some rather edgier posting. Malcom, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you here, Malcom. You seem to be absolutely box office if our listener numbers are anything to go by. I thought it would be useful to start with a look at standard US doctrine when it comes to invading countries. If we look at Iraq and if we look at Afghanistan as well, perhaps, we can really glean a little bit more about what America's options are when it comes to dealing with Iran. There have certainly been calls, even from some mainstream politicians like, of course, Lindsey Graham, among others, to really hit Iran directly and hard. But what if the US ultimately wanted to go for forced regime change? What if they wanted to invade Iran? What would that look like? Well, I think the first part of the strike would involve cyber attacks and standoff weapons and probably some of the US Air Force's stealth platforms like, in theory, F-22s and B-2 bombers, which would seek to attack and degrade and preferably destroy command control communications such as, Army HQ, the seat of government, seat of the executive, military control nodes and bases, telecoms infrastructure, TV, radio broadcast, that sort of thing, as well as focusing very much on the Iranian Air Force and air defenses. Now, once it had kind of degraded those with its standoff weapons like Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from submarines and surface vessels, as well as bombing raids from F-22s and B-2s and F-35s. It would then go on a concerted suppression of enemy air defense operation, which would likely involve multiple sorties, where basically it would seek to locate and then destroy Iran's air defenses, as well as mopping up whatever of the Iranian Air Force hadn't been destroyed on the ground in the initial round of strikes. That would then seek to establish air superiority, or preferably air supremacy, at which point it would the US would go after coastal defenses and border defenses. It would go after critical infrastructure such as electricity, water, and would start mopping up but softening up the Iranian ground forces. Finally, it would seek to concentrate airstrikes, probably in conjunction with US special forces and perhaps even some elite units as well, to secure ground invasion corridors and marine landing zones for the ground forces. The ground forces would then enter Iran. They would have an air force with air superiority, or probably air supremacy in theory, behind them. And those ground forces would seek to use speed and maneuver, and the United States' superior intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance technology and platforms to use maneuver as a way to isolate individual Iranian forces and bring down concentrated fires upon them, thereby defeating them and ultimately rolling them up and taking the country, or at least taking the government. That's a theory, Malcolm. That's certainly roughly how the last Iraq invasion worked in 2003. That's the way a lot of people would imagine things going now. People who've been brought up on the irresistibility of US military power. I mean, is that how it would go, Malcolm?
I mean, what you're talking about here is essentially a fairly antiquated way of warfare. Antiquated in the sense that the doctrine, insofar as it is a doctrine, and it's kind of up in the air whether it really is one. Like Blitzkrieg for Germany was kind of was made into a doctrine after the fact in some sense by Western observers, and wasn't really something in those terms that the German high command was using during the invasion of France, for example. But it's antiquated in the sense that this is like 3 decades old, at least. It's also obsolete in the sense that like none of these things that you bring up could conceivably work against Iran, because I recommend for any listener who doubts that to just go to Google and just Google map of Iran. What you will see is a country which is 5 times the size of Germany, by the way, that is essentially shaped like a fortress. You have all of these massive mountain ranges that essentially form a natural barrier protecting Tehran from pretty much every direction except from the north. And to the north, you have the Caucasus and you have Russia. So there are a couple of issues here that are essentially deal breakers for this plan, even in theory. The first deal breaker is planes have a certain range that they can travel before they have to turn around, or they have to be refueled in the air, or they will crash into the ground due to fuel starvation. Tehran is located farther away compared to, like, if you launch a plane from the Gulf of the Persian Gulf from an aircraft carrier, like an F-18, it might be able to get to Tehran barely carrying bombs. It's going to crash right after it drops those bombs. It doesn't have the range to get back. And the way you solve that generally is by aerial refueling. But the problem with aerial refueling is the US only has a limited number of those platforms. That's the minor problem. The major problem is these things are essentially slower commercial airliners, essentially. Like shooting down a an air tanker, like one of those refueling aircraft, it's the easiest thing in the world. Like, they are really slow. They're carrying a ton of fuel. So if you scratch them, they're going to go up in a big fireball. They have no like stealth. They have no like countermeasures. They're just big, slow flying targets. Which kind of hints at the big problem with the American way of warfare, which is it basically presupposes that the enemy is incapable of fighting back. Because if you're going to do this massive shock and awe bombing campaign against a massive country like Iran, which has, which has a lot of mountains, which makes it much harder to bomb hardened targets on the ground, you're essentially counting on them not being able to shoot at you. And so I remember reading like 15 years ago, like people in the US military basically saying that the old way of warfare probably wouldn't stand up to, it wouldn't really be useful in 2008. That's what people were arguing. But it's not 2008 anymore, it's 2024. And the US is much weaker than it was 2008. Technology has advanced. And again, Iran is not some sort of a 2-bit country. If you think about the amount of soldiers in the active military, last I checked, which was the day before yesterday, actually, Iran was number 7 in the world in terms of the size of the active duty military. The US was number 3. So it had essentially, like, Iran had something like 700,000 in the active military, and the US has 1.3 million, thereabouts. But then you realize that the American army is only 450,000. And the Iranian army is pretty much the equivalent size. So there is a problem of doctrine, but there is also a problem of scale in that the US doesn't really have, like, even if this doctrine would work, it would probably only work against a country maybe, half the size of Iran maximum, maybe a fourth the size really, with maybe 20 million people or so. Like, it might work against North Korea, it might not work against North Korea, but like Iran just has too much strategic depth for any sort of shock and awe campaign to work. And we're still only talking in theory. We're not talking about like the actual capabilities that the US can surge to the region, which are very limited because the US is not located in the Middle East.
So I'm going to say, let's just unravel that a little bit. Why can't such a campaign, a kind of super intensive bombing campaign that significantly degrades command and control, significantly degrades, if not destroys, an enemy air force and its air defense, why can't that work when followed up with a incredibly quick and highly maneuverable invasion when it comes to a country the size of Iran? Like, what is it about size that makes that difficult?
It's the same problem that the Germans had in Operation Barbarossa. Like, an armored division consumes a crap ton of fuel. And that was a problem for the Germans, but the Germans didn't use Abrams, which are not really, like, what people fail to understand is that the Abrams is a fairly old tank. It was designed originally in the 70s, and it was essentially designed to be used in Europe on the defense with like very, like German infrastructure against. Yes.
Right. So like moving back over its own infrastructure, essentially. So as it retreated, it would be coming closer and closer with its own logistics chain, if you like.
Yes. Like it has a turbine engine It doesn't have like a conventional diesel or gasoline engine. What this means is it has a prodigious fuel consumption. So if you try to do some sort of shock and awe thing, blazing across the deserts of Iran, you're going to run into the problem that, first of all, these deserts aren't really deserts. They're mountains. And tanks and mountains go together. Well, they're two great tastes that don't taste great together. Let's just say that. But also, even if the tanks were able to go through the mountains, like, there's just too much strategic depth. And so for every mile that these tanks travel, you really have to have this big logistic supply chain trailing behind them. So that's the first bottleneck on the ground. But on the air, there's another bottleneck, which is like, it's pretty similar in terms of, like, the US has, I don't know the exact figure. I think it's like 12,000, 13,000 airframes across every service. So that includes the Coast Guard. But this includes medevac helicopters, this includes transport helicopters, strategic airlift, and so on. So, 12,000 airframes, that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But the US lost around 10,000 airframes during the Vietnam War. And I shall remind you, Vietnam as a country, even today, it's not nearly as big or as powerful as Iran. So, like, you're going to lose a lot of airframes in a serious war. Like, the US has not fought a serious war against any sort of, like, regular opponent, including the North Vietnamese army, without losing thousands of airframes. It's never happened.
Yeah, when I was researching this a little bit, I looked into Iranian air defenses. And one of the things I found interesting is that they actually have a separate branch of the military devoted to air defense. So in the same way that the US has the Army, the Air Force, the Space Force, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, the Iranians have, an air defense force, essentially. And one of the things I was quite shocked about was the variety and breadth of the air defense platforms that they used. I expected it to be some kind of 1980s technology, Soviet S-300s, and maybe some, lower altitude, shorter range, kind of leftovers from the Shah's days, like some old US or British platforms from the Shah's days. But in fact, they have not maybe the most modern air defense. We're not talking about, Russian S-400s or S-500s or anything like that. But they do have the most recent S-300 model. They have their own upgraded S-300 model. Plus, 20 or 30 different air defense platforms, right from manpads, which are man-portable air defense systems, manpads, up to kind of, short-range missiles for kind of low altitude, right up to, as I say, their own upgraded version of the S-300 and the most modern Russian updated version of the S-300, which was delivered about 2013, I believe. So in terms of air defense, it is quite formidable and varied. I always remember that although it is true that the US Air Force knocked out Iraqi air defenses and command and control systems with consummate ease in 2003, I also remember that in 1999, during the bombing campaign of Serbia as part of the Kosovo campaign, NATO air forces did not completely ever at any stage suppress Serbian air defenses. My view is, albeit inexpert, is that Iranian air defenses are somewhat more formidable than Serbia's, and they have more places to hide them and distribute them.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a mountainous country that's, 100 times bigger than Serbia or whatever, with like a dedicated anti-aircraft arm of the armed services. Like it's 1,000 orders of magnitude a bigger challenge. But there's a sense in which 2003, like the Iraq invasion, it has to be one of the most destructive wars in the history of mankind in terms of what it did with the thinking inside the West. Because there's a really great book about this called the U.S. Army in Iraq, 2003 to 2012, I think. It's in the public domain, so you can just download it. There's an audiobook series on YouTube. I heartily recommend it. But one of the things that made the Iraq War such a pernicious war to draw lessons from is that we in the West thought that this really illustrated the technological supremacy of the West. And then, we didn't have enough, wherewithal or willpower or whatever to do nation building. But actually, like Saddam Hussein the lesson he drew from the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, sure was that like he couldn't compete with American technology, but also that like it was kind of superfluous for him to try to prepare his military for any sort of like actually fighting the Americans, not because it was hopeless, but because he figured that like the Americans would just do what Bush the Elder did, which is at most, send a couple of tomahawks and then ask some Kurds or Marsh Arabs or whatever to do a color revolution or whatever. So in the intervening years between the first Gulf War and the Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, what Saddam Hussein did was essentially defund the part of the military designed to, protect from an outside invasion, and instead reorient the entire state apparatus to dealing with internal domestic dissent. So this is a guy that has actually sort of, decommissioned his military in a very real sense. And yeah, the US rolls in after really crippling sanctions and sweeps that military, off the playing field in a week or two. Much to the surprise of the Americans, actually. They thought it would be tougher. But yeah, like they weren't actually fighting a guy who was even contemplating the idea of fighting back. And if you fight someone who has like lived in a universe or like had a mental like concept of warfare where it's like, I'm not going to be fighting the Americans because they're not going to be interested in an invasion. If you draw lessons about like Western military superiority from that and try to translate them to Iran, a country which has spent the last 30 years preparing for a war with the US, you're going to be cruising for a bruising.
Can I ask something? So I think one of the key things here is this reminds me very much of what happened with the Russian sanctions. We were quite skeptical of the Russian sanctions and so on the whole time, but in the interim, I found out, I don't know this for sure, but I think it's a little out of date information from a book I read, and it fits with what appears to have happened. It appears that the sanctions packages designed for Russia were probably designed in the mid-90s or something like that. And they were designed for effectively Boris Yeltsin's Russia, half collapsed, hyperinflation, people trading vodka for, coats or whatever. And basically they, nobody updated the program. They pulled it off the shelf. Lo and behold, it didn't work. Russia now is, as of last week, growing. The IMF is saying it grew faster in 2023 than all the other G7 economies, and in 2024 it will grow faster than all the G7 economies again. So this feels to me very similar. But I guess what I want to get at is you're saying, of course, that likely right now they're going to be analogizing to Iraq because they're both in the desert or something. Very much so feels that way. Oh, and they both have IRA in the name. So very easy that they'd do that. I can totally see DC brain going there. But here's a question. The way that maybe the Pentagon thinks about Iran right now, or at least the way that half sophisticated people who don't just tub thump all day think about Iran right now, is there an Iran that existed at some period in time, an Iran that was, okay, I get what you're saying about the specifics of the Second Iraq War. I didn't know that. That's interesting. But if you see what I'm saying, do we have an Iran, maybe in 1985 or something like that, that is the Iran of the imaginations of the people who think that they can just desert storm in and like win the game and everything like that? Or did that Iran never exist to begin with?
That's a really great question. I'm very glad you asked it. And the answer is yes, but also no. Like, there was a time where people really thought that really weak Iran existed, which was why the war between Iran and Iraq happened. Because, you know, you had this, like, Iran, after the revolution, went through a similar sort of, it was essentially the Soviet Union kind of in miniature. It was diplomatically isolated, economically isolated. And then you have Saddam Hussein, who looks at, Iran. And Iran has always been the big kid on the block in that part of the world. But now it's very weakened due to falling out with the US, due to being hit with all of these crippling sanctions, and having essentially jailed, executed, or exiled much of its military. So Saddam Hussein thinks that he can basically do the Nazi Germany thing of, you know, one kick to the door of this entire rotten building and it will all collapse. And so he does this sort of, you know, Iraq at this time has a bunch of fairly relatively modern, like, Soviet equipment. It has a bunch of Soviet trainers for the tank forces and so on. And they invade. And it takes a couple of months and they get completely bogged down because it turns out that even Iran, in its most weakened state it's been in for a very long time, is basically like invading the Soviet Union. The Iranians are able to draw upon like this massive wave of nationalism. They can essentially go to the prisons where they've imprisoned all of the failed revolutionaries, like all of the communist enemies and so on, and say, yeah, you know, I know you hate us because, like, this is the Islamic Revolution speaking. And we were slated to execute you, but here's the thing, Saddam Hussein has invaded, and we're not asking you to fight for Allah, we're asking you to fight for Iran. So here is your rifle, you're free to go, it's time to fight for the motherland. And people do that. And so they are able to cynically enjoy, like, exploit a ton of nationalism in the same way that the Soviet Union basically rediscovers Alexander Nevsky and Surovov and all of those, like, imperialist generals. Suddenly, like, these people are seen as heroes of the Russian people because Stalin finds that useful during a time of mass mobilization. And even, like, the enemies of the Bolsheviks are able to rally under the banner, essentially, to fight back the Germans. Well, the Iranians do the same thing because it's similarly a civilization state as the nomenclature goes. So the Iran-Iraq war very quickly turns into an absolute nightmare quagmire for Saddam Hussein. And that's when they were at their weakest.
One might argue, though, Malcolm, that, even today's reduced capacity US military is stronger than early 1980s Iraqi military.
Oh, yes, definitely. Sure. But are they stronger in the Middle East than Iraq in, the 1980s? Do they have more tanks in the Middle East? And the answer to that, because it's a very basic empirical question, is no.
And, couldn't they base them in NATO ally Turkey, in big ally, big regional ally Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain? Could they not base them even in the Caucasus? Could some Caucasus countries not be strong-armed?
I think the Caucasus, the problem is just, okay, by what means are you going to get them into Georgia or whatever? And that's awfully close to Russia. It's very unlikely that the Russians will sit idly by while their strategic ally is being invaded from a country which the Russians claim as being part of their own, backyard, essentially. That would be an even, like, putting NATO troops in the Caucasus would be an even bigger red line. Like an invasion army would be an even bigger red line than Ukraine NATO membership, actually. Like, for very obvious reasons. That's like, having the Chinese station a massive invasion army on the border with Texas.
So, okay, so the general feeling is that Iran is too big, the topography is too unsuitable, the logistics chains would be too long, and the US military simply doesn't have the scale or manpower to invade Iran. I saw a range of estimates for how many soldiers, how many infantrymen, how many, people in an army it would require to invade Iran. And I saw estimates, the kind of the lower end of the range for estimates was 1.6 million, which is way bigger than the entire current US Army and Marine Corps combined. And, that Army and Marine Corps has, garage mechanics and lawyers and accountants and all the rest of it.
I need to add one more thing, though, here, which is that the U.S. today has much less in terms of sea lift, which is essentially like the ability to transport material, fuel, tanks, ammunition, and so on over the sea. Like a lot of the stuff they used for 2003 was things they had since the first Gulf War. And so those ships, a lot of them have been scrapped due to old age and they haven't been replaced. But let's, for the sake of argument, say that's not true. And let's also, for the sake of argument, say that like the only thing you need to invade Iran is the same sort of force that you invaded Iraq with, which, again, the listeners should know, the US couldn't actually put up as a similar sized force today because like the military is smaller and weaker today. But let's say that's not true. There's a very simple reason why you couldn't do it right now, which is that in order to invade Iraq with the US being at 2003 levels of capacity, you needed essentially a year of slowly piling up ammo, fuel, tanks, spare parts, soldiers in neighboring countries. And so again, even if we say this is, you can do this with a force like an Iraqi-sized force, Joe Biden, if he gives the order for the Pentagon to use the nowadays non-existent sea lift to do the same thing, it's going to take like longer than the election. So this is not something you start with like 8 months before an election, because what if Trump comes in and says, yeah, good job piling up all this ammo, but I've changed my mind. I don't think invading Iran is a good idea. Like, this is something you do when you have time left in your presidential term of office. Because again, like, just the preparations are going to take a year. These preparations are going to be happening within the fire envelope of Iranian theater ballistic missiles also.
Yeah, can we just be specific about that? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but when Saddam Hussein is watching the build-up pre-Iraq war, he can't do anything about it, right? I mean, he's just a sitting duck, whereas Iran is sitting on one of the most sophisticated missile stockpiles in the world, like doing this build-up itself. Like, if they can hit all these Iraqi bases, these bases in Iraq and everything like that, and that's with proxy forces, like, there's absolutely no way they'd let this build-up occur, right?
Yeah, like the country you would have to use, I think, for any sort of invasion, like the only country that could conceivably agree is Iraq, because Iraq isn't necessarily a sovereign country right now. But like, if you're doing this build-up in Iraq, you have essentially a significant part of the Iraqi army, like part of the formal command structure of the army, like the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Hashd al-Shabi. These people are going to be attacking you inside of Iraq while you're, mustering forces. And that's not even mentioning the Iranians who are going to be attacking you. So it's like an invasion. It's just a fantasy. Like, Denmark might as well invade like Brazil or something.
So just before we move on from the invasion thing, here's a final question. I don't think you'd be expected to know the answer, but just from a conceptual point of view, this seems pretty clear to me. It seemed pretty clear before we talked. It's even more clear now that we've trashed it out. I don't expect people with DC brain, who are distracted by every shiny metal object, which is most people in politics in DC, to understand this stuff. Not most of them, anyway. The Pentagon clearly must understand some of this stuff. So do you think, or do you have any thoughts on, when Joe Biden and his cabinet go to the Pentagon and they say, we want options on the table, and one of them should be a full-scale war with Iran, including a potential ground invasion, do you think the Pentagon just turn around and say non-starter? Or do you think they have some, like, cope map where they, like, pretend that they're going to be able to do this and, like, sell it to politicians?
I think the Pentagon's position on that is, that sounds like a great idea, Joe Biden. As part of our plan to invade Iran, we only need a tiny little sort of help along the way from you guys. Just go to Congress, tell them we're reinstituting the draft and we need like 2 million soldiers. Once you give us our 2 million soldiers, we will be sending them all the way to Tehran, But until then, it's not going to happen. Like, that's what they're going to say. Because, again, this isn't really rocket science. These people have like tables and formulas and so on for, if you invade a country of so and so many square miles, you need X numbers of soldiers per square mile. They're just going to put in the number of square miles in Iran on that table or that Excel sheet or whatever, and it's going to like fart out, 2.4 million soldiers. And they're going to take that figure and say, well, unless you give us these soldiers, we can't do it.
Yeah, and by the way, in to quote the general from In the Loop, it's not just the 2.4 million soldiers or 1.6 million soldiers that you need to actually invade Iran. You need to have some soldiers left over at the end, or people tend to get the impression that you've lost, right? So it's not just the size of the invasion force, 1.6 million. It's also the 500,000 or so, however many it is, they need to maintain their general defense posture.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, like invading Iran, it's basically, it's on the same scale as invading the Soviet Union. Sure, the country isn't as big as Russia, which is the biggest country in the world, but it's not like the Germans got all the way to Vladivostok or the Ural Mountains or whatever. Like, they were bogged down fairly quickly. Like, they didn't even really get to Moscow. And so I don't really remember, I don't have the figure exactly in my head for how many people, inhabitants the Soviet Union had in 1941. but I don't think it was more than 90 million, which is what Iran has today. So you're invading a country which is insanely nationalistic, and which, is not only nationalistic, but also majority Shia Islam, which is a religion famous for sort of stressing the virtue of martyrdom, let's just say. Like, this is not a country that's going to have a hard time finding people to basically fight the foreign invaders. And they've demonstrated this. They've demonstrated this in a sort of almost like fantastical, like fantasy way, in terms of like how crazy the Iran-Iraq war was. So you're gonna need a lot of soldiers for this.
So Malcolm, you are Joseph Robinette Biden, and the Pentagon has said, no, sorry, we're not going to invade Iran. There's no chance that we can do a land invasion, or at least not until you have got a politically impossible draft of 2 million soldiers in place from Congress. So perhaps the US president would ask for a bombing campaign, missile strikes into Iran itself, i.e. not against Iranian proxies in the Middle East, but inside the territory of Iran. Now, a lot of people in the American media and the British media are talking about this, even encouraging this, even saying that it needs to be done because of what Iran is doing with its proxy forces around the Middle East. And in fact, a lot of, fairly influential people and politicians are talking about such a bombing campaign. Now, even if a land invasion wouldn't work out, a bombing campaign would do a lot of damage to Iran, wouldn't it, Malcolm?
Well, the question is, and this kind of gets at the heart of the big problem in the West right now, is that like nobody has.
What is the question? How does it get to the heart of the West right now? What is it that nobody has? If you're on the Patreon Club, these answers should present themselves almost instantly. On the other side of the velvet rope, we have an hour more of Malcolm and the lads, discussing the future of the region and the real alternatives to the present soup the West is drowning in. If you're not yet a patron, we'd like to thank you for listening and let you know that we'll be back at the same time next week with another regular episode. Of course, you could always sign up. $5, pounds or euros a month. Cancel any time. Just search Multipolarity on Patreon and help us chart the fall of the old world order.